This episode of Gators Breakdown is brought to you by Manscaped. Get 20% off plus free shipping and 2 free gifts when you purchase this Father's Day, the new Perfect Package 3.0 kit with promo code Gators. Head over to manscaped.com and purchase yours today.
Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me this week is co-host Will Miles. You can find him at readandreaction.com and on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. Will, one of my favorite episodes of the year coming up here when we look at the college football magazines. It's a lot of people look at SEC media days and media days in general as kind of the kickoff for football, but for me, it usually starts around when these college football preview magazines come out. So, God, that's when I know football is pretty close. And with everything we've dealt with this past spring, you know, it was good to see these, you know, magazines on newsstands and getting us into some sense of normalcy around the same time usually that they come out, a week or two delayed. They're to be understandable, of course, with everything going on, but plenty to talk about and diving into these magazines and how much these magazines and these publications, Athlon and Lindy's in particular, that's the ones we'll look at here, and how much they like the Gators for 2020. We got to hear from Dan Mullen a little bit today too, so we'll get into that before we get into the preseason magazines, Will. But man, a lot of football to talk about.
Yeah, it's nice. I actually had my first baseball practice with my son because we've opened up. We had that today, so it feels a little bit weird to be having your first baseball practice, which is usually right around the spring game, and we're having that now in June. But yeah, it's an interesting time, right? To have football coming, and it's getting hot down there in Florida. I'm sure it's getting nice up here in Pennsylvania. So excited to talk about football. Excited to talk about the Gators, and hopefully COVID will stay away long enough that we can at least get the season in.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Dan Mullen hit on too. Of course, when he met with the media on another Zoom press conference today, I put the whole press conference up on the Gators Breakdown YouTube channel. So if everybody wants to go check it out, I reached out after that, and they said they're more than fine to share it out there. So everybody, you can check out the whole. It's about 30 minutes of Dan Mullen, even an interruption in the middle of it. Dan Mullen said he had to go talk to a recruit right in the middle of the Zoom conference. So that was pretty cool for the coach to do that. To do that there. But yeah, about 30 minutes with the media, and just a couple of takeaways here, Will, before we get to the preseason mag talk here. Mentioning not moving too fast to begin with here, and be cautious in how they approach the workouts with the players, and keep the players safe in that regard. Quote, "We've been very slowly working back up." And I think a lot of it is due to do with the probably imbalance of the guys coming back. Some of them probably did do everything they needed to do and stay in shape, but some guys probably weren't able to, no fault of their own, and being up to speed where a football team would normally be at this time. So you and I, we kind of joked around about it last week of having to be around Nick Savage for the first week, and how much fun that probably wouldn't be. But when you kind of take back and look at it in a more serious approach, this is going to take some time, and not only physically, but probably mentally as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think everybody's coming back. People have different tolerance levels and different levels of nervousness with the virus. So obviously, you got to be sensitive to that sort of thing. You have to be sensitive to the fact that they've each got parents that are going to have different levels of comfort with that as well. So you've got all sort of these new policies keeping people apart. I'm sure washing hands and hand sanitizer. And, last week I had read that they had moved the weight room into the indoor practice facility to make sure everybody had space. So obviously they're dealing with that. I think the other thing that you got to think about is not necessarily wearing people out from a physicality perspective. I think the things they probably need to watch out for are the things like the soft tissue injuries. Mm-hmm. So, ACLs and Achilles and those sorts of things where the muscles aren't necessarily in condition to be able to support those ligaments. So you don't want people cutting and doing all sorts of stuff that maybe they would do coming back initially in fall camp because they've been with the strength and conditioning program the entire off season. I think maybe those are the things where you eliminate some of the stuff that puts real stress on the joints, and at least for a little bit, you sort of, lower the amount of what you don't want to see is non-contact soft tissue injuries because you've rushed back to drills that require people to cut and move, right? And so I think the weight training, they're going to go hard after. I think the conditioning, they're going to go very hard after. But I think when it comes to the actual making of a football move, yeah, that'll probably be much slower.
Yeah, and one more takeaway, Will, there. Of course, it was asked of players missing spring practice and how that may affect. And I don't think for any negative reason at all, just only because of the position that he plays. But, Mullen singled out Anthony Richardson, basically saying, hey, look, him missing a spring, puts him behind the learning curve a bit. And it makes total sense. He was going to be an early enrollee, going to be an early enrollee the entire time. And, to me, once you, even at the quarterback position, I guess once you take part in a spring and then go through summer camp, fall camp, all that stuff, to me, that does give you a leg up. You're not necessarily looked at as a true freshman when you go through spring as when you should have been a high school senior or going to your prom and all that stuff. That gives you some experience, and he lost out on that. And a lot of big time quarterbacks and a lot of quarterbacks now are trying to get to campus as soon as possible, go through their first spring. And I thought it was noticeable that Mullen singled out his reputation for developing quarterbacks, and we know how good that is. And saying it does hurt a bit, a true freshman missing his first spring when it would have given him a bit more experience. So luckily he got the couple bowl practices that he was there. Luckily that he got to him and Josh Braun both got to take part in before Florida went down to Miami and practiced down there. But the practices that they had on campus, Anthony Richardson and a couple other players were able to take part in. So he got a little bit there. But I did find it interesting that Mullen kind of singled out a young quarterback missing this valuable experience early on in his career.
Sure. I mean, obviously you missed the spring practices, but he was there on campus until March when everything closed down. So he has more time in the program than somebody maybe who's just coming in the fall. More comfort level with the coaches. He certainly had the playbook and maybe an understanding of what they were going to expect him to learn and to be able to give that. So he still has a leg up. I think the real issue is with Florida is that there's not any reps to go around, right? Yeah. They have 6 weeks to prepare for the season, and those 6 weeks are going to have to be used on getting Kyle Trask ready to play and making sure that Emory Jones is ready if anything happens to Trask. Because here's the reality. If Anthony Richardson is playing meaningful minutes for Florida at quarterback, there are real problems in terms of at the quarterback position. I mean, obviously you hope he's going to do well and you hope he'd be prepared, but I don't think you go into the season thinking that you're going to need to utilize your third string quarterback extensively. And that may be a position that they're put in based on injuries, but that's the only way he's going to get in the game for anything other than the 4. And then they're going to redshirt him. Right. So he's going to have spring practice next year. That'll be his opportunity to get more reps. He'll probably get some reps during the season, like I mentioned, against teams like Eastern Washington and some other games where Florida gets way ahead and maybe you bring him in. But, to be honest, Mullen was really pretty hesitant. He spent a lot of time developing Trask last year in games when Florida was way ahead, when I think the fans' expectation was Emory Jones was going to come in and get some reps. And instead Trask was left in the game. And so I don't know that we're going to see Anthony Richardson a lot during the season, just because I think he's going to want to get Emory Jones the reps when Florida's up big if Trask is the starter. And maybe Richardson comes in to get reps if Emory Jones happens to win the job.
All right. So that's the main takeaways I had from Mullen's press conference today. Like I said, coming up this episode, a lot of preseason mag talk. Athlon Lindy's out. We'll hit those. My favorite part, the anonymous coach talk there, and we get to kind of break down what we think the coaches mean and all that stuff. And always probably the best. That's the first thing I turn to, Will, when I get these magazines. That's my favorite part as well, and some interesting thoughts as well throughout both magazines previews here. A lot of interesting topics that they think about for the Gators. So before we get there, remember you can find Gators Breakdown at news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes, as well as News4Jax coverage of the Gators. Please share, rate, and review the show. Subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, and follow Gators Breakdown on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So here we go, Will. And man, I tell you what, both of these preseason magazines and their rankings, think very highly of Florida here. Athlon ranks the Gators 6th, and Lindy's ranks the Gators 5th, both ahead of the Georgia Bulldogs, Will. So that's the big headline there. Both publications pick Florida ahead of Georgia and to win the SEC East. Athlon projects the Gators in the Orange Bowl, though, versus North Carolina. So back-to-back Orange Bowl appearances, not picking the Gators in the playoffs here. So the only thing I'll basically read word from word in these magazines are, well, these what they said about Florida in these rankings. So starting with Athlon here, the Gators are clearly moving forward and are certainly in a better position than either of their significant in-state rivals, and that's a big plus for Dan Mullen. He has made the Gators contenders again in the SEC East, and anyone interested in complaining about an 11-2 record should take it somewhere else. Still, Florida fans aren't looking for participation trophies. They're not even too charged up about an Orange Bowl win over Virginia. These folks want another head ball coach or another Urban Meyer. They want SEC championships. They want national championships. And as long as the folks to the north have won 3 straight in the cocktail party, there isn't going to be a lot of chuckling in Gainesville. The good news is that Mullen's 3rd year at Florida, and he has been stockpiling talent the whole time he's been in Gainesville. This year might have brought his best class yet, but the new kids aren't likely to make huge contributions right away. So it's up to quarterback Kyle Trask, who's done a pretty darn good job last year, to get better. And some of those young receivers need to step up. Defensive lines need some youngsters to become standouts. Last sentence here, Will, pretty close. The Gators are getting closer. They might even be ready this year. So, very lofty ranking there for the Gators. Top 10, number 6 for Athlon. They were top 10 in these preseason magazines as well last year, but it was more of a program that is on the rise and won't challenge for the East, but may give Georgia some trouble. This year they're picking Florida ahead of Georgia, and maybe even making more noise for the 2020 season. Anything from that quick summary from Athlon there, Will, that caught your ear?
Yeah, I mean, they obviously talk about the recruiting and bringing in a higher level of athlete, and I think that's true compared to Jim McElwain, but I think when you compare it to Georgia and Alabama and even LSU, obviously we've talked about that pretty extensively.
Yeah, I don't think I would necessarily label it as stockpiling talent. that to me is only reserved for a few programs out there.
Well, and then the other thing is they didn't mention the schedule, right? And I think one of the big reasons why people look at Florida and think that I think most people look at Florida and say this team may not be as good as last year's team overall, but it's not going to matter because the teams that they're playing are not going to be that good either. And when it doesn't look like South Carolina is going to be any good, Vanderbilt's always terrible, Missouri's not going to be any good. You got Ole Miss on the schedule as your Western opponent instead of Auburn this year. So that's maybe the thing that 11-2 would be the minimum, really, when you think about what this year needs to be, right? I mean, that's losing the games that you hope you win against LSU and Georgia, and then winning a bowl game, and that's what they did last year, and so I think that's the minimum of what people's expectations are. So I know there was would
probably be a disappointment.
Well, and I know there was the comment about people being upset with an 11-2 record, but let's be honest, the Florida fans have not set the expectations. Dan Mullen came to town saying the Gator standard, and the Gator standard, he was sitting there at the press conference today behind in front of 3 national championship trophies. He didn't put those up there on accident. He didn't walk into this season saying, I expect to go undefeated on accident, right? He thinks he's going to have a good team. He thinks he's got a shot at winning the championship. And so it's going to be really interesting to see whether he can fulfill those expectations. So, the reality is I think there's going to be a subset of the Gator faithful who are upset with a 6th ranked finish, which is interesting. But again, if it's a 6th ranked finish with wins over Georgia, I think we'll deal with it.
Yeah, I can deal with that. That's the only way I'll be happy with, like a 6th ranking and not a playoff appearance if Georgia's that victory, if one of those victories. I'll go to Lindy's here too. Like I said, Gators ranked 5th in Lindy's, 1 spot ahead of Athlon there, and it kind of does go to your point. They do mention the schedule a bit here. So it says the good news: the team seemed to get better with Kyle Trask settling in at quarterback. Mullen still hasn't landed an elite quarterback, but his touch with Tim Tebow and Dak Prescott is already a legend. Look for a fast start, and here you go, Will. 5 of the Gators' first 6 games are at home, including LSU. So not only an easier schedule, just when you look at the teams, but sets up very favorably at home. And Florida barely leaves the state of Florida this year when you turn around and look at it. We're playing Georgia and Jacksonville, playing Florida State, and all the home games this year. You go to Knoxville, you go to Ole Miss, and Nashville, Tennessee, I think, right? Yeah. So you don't leave the state of Florida all that much this year. Sets up pretty good. It says here, even with the loss of LaMichael Piron, the tailback position is deep and talented. Watch Dameon Pierce and Malik Davis. Bad news. 4 of the top 6 pass catchers are gone. Cornerback C.J. Henderson turned pro. The defense further lost pass rushing stud Jonathan Grenard with 9.5 sacks and fellow NFL draft pick Jabari Zuniga. Lindy's call. A win over Georgia is imperative. The Gators have lost 3 in a row and 6 of 9 in the series. Loftier expectations will have to wait until the cocktails are consumed in Jacksonville on Halloween. With Georgia retooling, Florida has to grab a hold of the East, at which time the sky becomes the limit. So both publications will kind of leave it open to, hey, look, if Florida, first of all, this is kind of the year, and we've talked about that endlessly. Both, of course, are mentioning how imperative the Georgia game is. Of course, look, we've probably talked more about Georgia in these last 3 months than we've had combined on the podcast because Florida's that close, and that's just that one of those last hurdles that Florida has to get over here. I mean, both kind of talking about the sky's the limit for this team here. And the expectations, but yeah, there's just so much of Georgia, like I said, Georgia retooling, and this is a chance for the Gators to grab a hold of the SEC East.
Well, and maybe they talk about it in the Georgia preview. I don't know, but Georgia does not have a cupcake schedule this year, right? I mean, right. I think they've got Alabama early, and then they've got Auburn before they ever play Florida too. So this isn't. Everybody's pointing to the Georgia game. I think winning that Georgia game means a lot for Mullen. I think it'll mean a lot for recruiting for Mullen. I think it'll mean a lot for Georgia from the standpoint of their belief in Kirby Smart. But I think Florida can win the East and still lose the Georgia game if things fall right. And that's the reason that I think people should pick Florida if they're going to pick Florida to win the East. It's that this isn't a year where Florida's ability to win the East hinges on that one game. If they can beat LSU, if they can win the road game at Ole Miss, which is one I'm a little bit worried about just because of where it lies in the schedule, they could potentially lose to Georgia. Georgia will still have 2 SEC losses. I mean, Kirby showed last year that he's able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory against South Carolina. And there have been a couple of those on his resume thus far where his team has just come out flat and hasn't been able to beat a team that they really should have beaten like a drum. If he does that again, Alabama and Auburn are going to be tough outs for Georgia, especially if Newman doesn't play as well as people expect. So I guess everybody in the preview magazines is pointing to Georgia. We've spent an awful lot of time talking to Georgia, but I think you need to pay attention to the rest of the season too, because one slip up against Kentucky, against Ole Miss, against Tennessee, even against LSU makes the margin of error much less, right? One SEC loss and you have to win that Georgia game. If you can run the gauntlet and the only team you got to beat is Georgia, you still may be able to sneak in and win the East, even if Georgia's able to beat you.
Yep, pretty interesting there. While we're sitting here talking a lot about Florida, Georgia, and all that stuff, I'll go ahead and preview next week. We'll have Braden Gall on from Athlon Sports. He'll, did a lot of the writing here in the Athlon magazine. He'll join us for a Florida Georgia debate show. Got a couple Georgia buddies that's going to jump on as well. Robert and he's a Georgia fan. They got a podcast out there. He's gonna hop on as well, and gonna have a good Florida Georgia debate show. So that's kind of preview for next week. I think Will and we can give positives and negatives for Florida winning the SEC East, and I expect them to do the same there. Braden has pretty much said we'll get into something too later with the SEC coaching rankings that will make some headlines as well when you look at these. But it's going to be a lot of fun having a Florida Georgia debate type of show next week. So, Will, let's go ahead and fast forward a bit here, and here we go. We'll go ahead and start with the my favorite parts of these magazines of what opposing coaches have to say about the Florida Gators. And here in the Athlon, opposing coaches size up Florida. Quote, they have a chance to be really special this year, but there are a lot of questions. Where are they in terms of talent and firepower? Can they beat Georgia? You feel really good about what they've done in comparison to the rest of the East, but they're still behind one school. The quarterback change made them a completely different program. They're a better, more aggressive offense with Kyle Trask. The team speed is really good. It's as good as it ever was there. I'll stop there, Will. Team speed, nah, still not close to those 08, 09, Urban Meyer teams when Rainey, Demps, and James all over the field, and just overall defensive speed as well. I think, and I mean, this is coming from a coach. I mean, they see it that way, but no, I don't ever we disagree with what the coach says in these things. I don't ever want to make it sound like we know more than coaches, or even when we question coaches, I don't want to make it sound like that. But no, we know this team's nowhere near as fast as those Urban Meyer teams. So maybe a little too friendly there for that. But I did find it interesting, Will, that I don't know if we ever really worded it this way last year when we were looking at the offense, but a more aggressive offense with Kyle Trask. That one really caught my ear.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is a function of what they were forced to do. So if you look at Mullen 2 years ago with Felipe Franks, it was a very, very run-heavy offense. And it even started out the season against Miami last year as a pretty run-heavy offense. And then when Trask came in against Kentucky, they were down by 11 points or something like that, maybe even 16. And at that point, they had to open it up, and they never really closed it up, right? It was the running game could never get going. The right side of the offensive line struggled a ton, and Trask was forced to throw the ball. I think the big difference is, and I looked at this for something a couple of weeks ago, Trask got the ball out in something like 2.3 seconds on a regular basis, and Franks got it out in 2.6. So the offense felt faster and felt crisper because the ball was coming out quicker. And I think once Mullen realized that he could trust Trask to get the ball out quickly, then he was able to trust him with some of the things, some of the screen passes, bubble passes, things that were sort of extensions of the run game that allowed them to work around some of their deficiencies. So, we'll see. I think this year, Trask throws the ball to the right guy. It's still yet to be seen whether they have the right guys at receiver to be able to catch the ball and get open so that Trask can hit them. But it's also yet to be seen. I think we all expect there's going to be an increase in the efficiency of the running game too. And so, I suspect there's going to be a little bit more balance this year. It'll probably feel like Florida's not quite as explosive maybe early on because they're kind of finding their legs in terms of what they want to do and who they want to be. But I think by the time we get to that LSU game, they're going to be willing to ride with Trask because certainly last year they were able to do so.
Pick it up here, still in Athlon here. He goes, everyone wants to claim it, but it really is between them and LSU for the DBU title. They have guys in that secondary who you can trust to cover in man, guys who can fly to the ball and then go play to run. Here we go, Will. And here's the one that's going to catch everybody. Todd Grantham has a great third down package. He really mixes it up. There we go. They can kill you there with the different pressure packages because of how talented they are at every position. What we saw last year was the recruiting and development is back up, so they don't have to be as exotic. They're shifting around less and can play you in their base. That's when the defense can really get dangerous. They're still a step behind Georgia in recruiting. Dan Mullen is maybe the best project guy in recruiting. He can get more out of a 3-star on offense than maybe anyone in the nation, but that's not Florida. You have to win the big battles for the 5 stars and flip them into NFL players. There's still a question of Dan as a big game coach. He's a great play caller. He's a great scheme guy. He's a great developer. But where is the signature win? In many ways, Florida's 2020 comes down to Georgia. They could lose that game, win 10, and be a disappointment. Pretty much kind of what we've already said there, Will. But even coaches are mentioning how big this Georgia game is for Dan Mullen and the Gators. So kind of quickly summarize that one, Will. I did put it out on Twitter because I knew the fan base would get a kick out of it with a fellow coach out there saying, talking about Todd Grantham's great third down package. And look, we discussed it ad nauseum. Third and Grantham came from his days at Georgia. Yes, it was an issue for the last decade or so. It hasn't been that big of an issue overall. The biggest issue, and we've talked about it a lot, Will, especially when we talked earlier about how Florida could get better for 2020. Third down defense has just got to be better in the big games, and it's more about the clutch performances. And when the third downs happen, that makes it such an issue for Todd Grantham in that third down defense.
Yeah, I would say that third down comment probably didn't come from Jake Fromm or Joe Burrow, but that's the reality, right? Is that the experienced quarterbacks have been able to pick apart his defense, and I think a lot of that has to do with their ability to read what he's trying to do. My disappointment with Grantham last year, at least in the Georgia game, wasn't that he came out playing soft in terms of zone. I actually thought that was probably the right move based on the personnel. My disappointment is that when that clearly wasn't working, they didn't ever take any shots. Like there wasn't. It didn't feel like they took shots where they just said, "All right, we're bringing the house. We're going to leave the guys one-on-one on the backside, and we'll see what happens." Now, you have a chance to win the game because you haven't given up a big play, but you don't really have many opportunities to take shots because your offense can't get on the field. So there's a little bit of a balance there. I think it still boils down to the experienced quarterbacks have repeatedly exploited his defense. And I think that bodes well for 2020 because when you go down the whole list, I mean, you got Terry Wilson, who's coming off a knee injury, has some experience in Kentucky. You got Jarek Warrantano at Tennessee. I don't think anybody's really afraid of him. You got Miles Brennan at LSU.
Guarantano is probably going to be the most experienced one out of the whole group.
Well, and I mean, if Tennessee gets off to a slow start, you'll even have Mara in the game at that point. So, I mean, just go down the list. I mean, John Reese Plumlee is maybe the guy who scares me the most, just because he's the guy who Grantham's teams have tended to struggle with running quarterbacks. Whether or not, especially when you look at like that Kentucky game from a couple of years ago, where Wilson lit him up, and you just sort of go down the board. There's no guy who fits that. Jake Fromm, Joe Burrow, Tua, Bentley. Even Bentley at South Carolina was somebody that you maybe might have been a little bit afraid of. Yeah. And, he's not around either. So I just don't think that there's anybody on the schedule you go, yeah, that's the kind of guy who tends to get Grantham. So, yeah, I think he's probably going to have a pretty successful year.
And, well, one thing, I'll kind of bounce away from this one a bit, saying, where's the signature win? I mean, okay, so he hasn't beat Georgia in his first 2 years, but I think there's plenty of signature wins for Dan Mullen in his first 2 seasons. I mean, from where he came from and looking at his first 2 seasons, maybe, if you're looking at the Gator program overall, maybe not, but for him in his first 2 seasons, I think the LSU game in 2018 is a signature win. I think the Auburn game this past year is one. Actually, the Peach Bowl, Michigan, too, going back. You had to have that win. In Florida's title, losing to Michigan for one. And that was kind of a chance to solidify. I know Michigan didn't have their whole team and all that stuff, but with Michigan not playing their whole team, that was a game you couldn't lose. That was a game you needed to go out there and win, and showing that you're taking the next step there. So I kind of shy away from saying he doesn't have a signature win. Georgia would be the signature win, but it doesn't mean he doesn't have a signature win so far.
I mean, I sort of understand where that discussion point comes from. When you look at the wristband fiasco last year with Georgia, you look at some of the organizational things that we've heard around recruiting, those sorts of things make you look and go, okay, everything's not perfect. But then he goes out and he schemes up something that just absolutely demolishes Michigan. And you go, okay, well, all right, we're headed in the right direction. I mean, I don't think you can argue with 10-3 and 11-2, right? The issue is you will find people who argue with 10-3, 11-2, 11-2, and you'll really find people who argue with 10-3, 11-2, 10-3. So, this year is sort of a signature year for him. Not just, I mean, everything lines up, right? The expectation I think most people had is that Emory Jones was going to be taking over this year for his first year as a starter. But now you've got a senior quarterback coming back who performed last year. I think everybody expected the offensive line to have some growing pains last year, and they certainly did. But now you bring in Reese at right tackle or right guard, and those guys all have another year in the program. I think you look on the defensive side of the ball, they've gotten Brenton Cox coming in as a 5-star guy. You've got Gervon Dexter coming in at defensive tackle. You've got Elam and Marco Wilson on the outside. So, the reality is he's got everything sets up for 2020 to be a big deal for him. And the signature one is Georgia. Let's be honest. Urban Meyer was always really big on rivalry games. Steve Spurrier was really big on rivalry games. Beating Florida State right now is good, but it is not a signature, right? Florida State is struggling. Beating LSU it was a great signature win 2 years ago. That's maybe the one that I'd think of. Yeah. Hanging with them last year, I think, is much more impressive in retrospect when you look back at what LSU was able to do. But I think it's legitimate. With the criticism of Mullen coming into Florida was that he couldn't beat the big boys when he was at Mississippi State, and I think we all looked at that and said, well, it's hard to recruit at Mississippi State, and he's going to have better players at Florida, so he needs to win those games. And I think when you look at his last 5 years, I think from 2011 to 2019 or 2016 to 2019, he's won 11 of 22 games against teams with more talent from a recruiting standpoint. So he's won 50% of them. The difference is he's had to play 22 of those games, and Georgia's only had to play 2. So when you look at the difference in schedules and the difference in talent, that's really where the difference lies. So yes, the Michigan game was big. The Florida State game a couple years ago, where Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was putting the flag at midfield, that was big. The LSU game 2 years ago was big. Certainly, even the Virginia game last year didn't feel that big, but the season feels different if you have a loss there. Like going from 10-3 to 11-2, I think makes everybody feel differently versus if it had been another 10-3 season with a loss in the bowl. So I don't think anybody's going to, well, I'm certainly not going to complain about what Mullen did his first 2 years. But you know what? Part of the problem is when you go 21-5, there's only one place, there's only one place to go that's any better, and that's the expectation. And that is the signature win against Georgia, right? That is the big rivalry right now. That's the one everybody's pointing to. And at some point you have to win the game that you circled on the calendar. And that's the one that's circled. And so he's going to have to win it.
Well, I will say, for 2020, that definitely is if Georgia and LSU are the only 2 games that you can point to that would say those are signature wins. There's no other game on the schedule unless, you get a surprise Tennessee team somehow and you beat them, but you won't know till later in the season how big that win was until you have to go back and look at, it would have to be a surprise team. But right now, looking at the schedule, you would say the only chance for signature wins on the schedule are Georgia and LSU, especially Georgia, of course, here. So Lindy's in the anonymous report here is, quote, I think Florida has the potential to have a really, really good year. Dan Mullen is a little weird, but he has an uncanny ability to take the talent he's given and get them to play at a high level. He did it at Mississippi State, and he's got a lot more talent at Florida. I think he puts his guys in position to be successful. Now, these are probably different thoughts here, so I'll start over here. I think he's got a lot more talent at Florida. I think he puts his guys in positions to be successful on offense. He does as good of a job as anyone of calling plays to put his players in position to succeed. Quarterback Kyle Trask is a very talented young man who is doing what Dan Mullen asked him to do. Here we go, Will, and another Todd Grantham headline here. And this one really, really caught the eye of everybody. Quote, I also think they've got the best defensive coordinator, Todd Grantham, in the league. They're not where they need to be yet with defensive talent, but they're getting there. They're missing difference makers up front, potential first-round guys. They do not have pass rushers like they did a year ago, but maybe Grantham will generate it. That's a smart dude now. The best defensive coordinator in the league, Will, this is what this coach says of what Todd Grantham. I'm a Grantham believer. I'm a Grantham fan, and this year will probably prove a whole lot. Of course, the Georgia game itself, and just getting better in general, having to replace some guys. They question up front. Last year I think we were kind of questioning up front as well with Ja'Kai Polite leaving. We knew the potential of Jabari Zuniga. We didn't know a whole lot about Jonathan Gennard and how he was going to show up. Those guys show up and become, if they're on when they're on the field, are guys who really, really got after the quarterback. We'll get into it a bit later. I'm not too worried about the pass rush under Todd Grantham. That's just, to me, pretty much a given in his defense here. I don't know if I'd go as far as calling him the best defensive coordinator in the league, especially if you want to count some of the head coaches that are kind of also defensive coordinators in the league as well. I think that's maybe a stretch, but I do like Todd Grantham. He gets paid like one of the best, defensive coordinators in the country. So he needs to be up there, and he needs to start producing in some of the bigger games here, especially in the third down defense there. But Well, I mean, it starts off, Dan Mullen's a little weird, but he has an uncanny ability here to take the top level talent and Grantham being the best defensive coordinator. A lot of interesting thoughts from opposing coaches.
I mean, let's be honest. Mullen is a little bit weird, right?
Yeah.
but weird people usually are awfully successful because they don't care what other people think.
And weird doesn't mean bad.
No, I think. I mean, it depends. He's a little bit weird, right? He's a strange cat, and that's fine. He's also really stubborn, and I think sometimes that drives people crazy. But he's been proven right on some of the quarterbacks that he's been stubborn with. The Grantham comment, like you said, the head coaches. I think Saban is the best defensive coordinator in the country, let alone in the SEC. And the other thing is that when you evaluate college coaches, you have to evaluate them on their ability to develop players, their ability to out scheme the opposition, and then their ability to recruit the best players. And you take all three of those things together. So you have a defensive coordinator who can't scheme his way out of a paper bag, but brings in the best players, and that's still going to be a pretty successful defense. I think when you look at Grantham, I don't know that I've looked at it historically in the past. I don't know that he adds a whole lot from a recruiting perspective. Like, he's not a negative or anything like that, but he's not some guy who just comes in and all of a sudden 5 stars are flocking to his program. Again, I think he comes off as a little bit abrasive, and there are probably some players who, and a little bit of a disciplinarian, and there are probably some people who don't necessarily gravitate to that as recruits. So the recruiting aspect is part of when you're evaluating who's the best coach. But again, the other thing is the SEC's kind of gone nuts the last few years when it comes to offense. So, who is if you eliminate head coaches, but you presume that Saban and Smart are calling the defenses. Yep. I mean, is it Aranda who's no longer at LSU? And, how do you like who's the best guy when it goes? Matt Luke was essentially the defensive coordinator at Ole Miss. So
I probably would put Grantham there, but to me, he is clearly behind Saban and Smart.
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on how you rank it, I suppose.
Yeah, right. If he's just the sole defensive coordinator, maybe that's what this coach is talking about. Then maybe so.
Well, and if you look schematically, I think you could make an argument that he's as effective as Smart. I just think that Smart has better players, or has had better players the last 2 or 3 years, and you can scheme and scheme and scheme and scheme, but if a guy's not fast enough to cover Jerry Jeudy, that's a problem, right? And if you've got a guy who's fast, he can make up for the step that he takes in the wrong direction if he's got special level talent. So the defensive coordinator can only put his players in a position to succeed. I think for the most part, Grantham's been able to do that. I think the defense has been top 20 the last 2 years, especially when you look at yards per play allowed, which I think is the best way to evaluate things. So Grantham has made a difference on the defensive side of the ball. It's certainly better than watching a Randy Shannon defense. But is he the best in the SEC? I don't think so. I don't think he's earned that title yet. I think when Florida turns in a performance where they are a top 10 defense, then maybe we start saying that. And let's be honest, if Florida's a top 10 defense, team's finishing better than 6th.
Oh, absolutely. Yep, definitely with what we expect from this offense as well. You get a top 10 defense, and that sets the Gators up pretty good here. Further in Athlon's Gator look here, Will. I'm not going to go through it all, but they have this little section called Outside the Huddle. One of them that caught my eye here, third-year blues. And it says, year 3 has not been kind to Florida coaches. Even Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer suffered a dip during their third year, winning 9 games following SEC title seasons. For other Gator coaches, the third season has been mostly costly. Ron Zook and Michael Wayne were fired, while Will Muschamp's 4-8 season in 2013 laid the groundwork for his 2014 ouster. Dan Mullen's third team appears poised for big things, but will have to overcome recent history. And pretty crazy trend there, when you go back and think about it. And you have discussed, plenty of times the fall off from the 2016 to the 2017. Of course, you had Tebow and Harvin and that offense, going on to win the Heisman Trophy and setting records, but the defense fell off, and Florida, loses to Michigan in a bowl game. And as they mentioned, Spurrier's fall as well in his third year. A lot of it goes to what happened. What do you do in recruiting early in your tenure and the transition year and guys leaving the program because you weren't their original coach. So much happens to the roster there. But hey, look, this is probably one place where we look at maybe this is one area the transfer portal also helps, is because now you have an easier way of guys who left the program, and not, we didn't see a whole exodus of players between the transition of McElwain and Mullen. A lot of guys did kind of stick around, guys who were on the roster. We didn't see a whole lot of guys just get up and leave. They wanted to be part of what Florida and Dan Mullen was doing there. But there will be something interesting to watch, and given the history of what Athlon shares here of third-year head coaches at Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happened for different reasons, right? I mean, the 2006 team wins the national championship. None of the young guys got any time.
Yep.
So they were busy winning the national championship. So the next year, you've got, I think it was Joe Hayden starting on the outside for the first time. You've got a lot of guys sort of breaking in for the first time on defense, especially the defensive side of the ball. And yeah, Tebow went nuts and wins the Heisman Trophy, but the defense couldn't stop anybody, particularly that bowl game against Michigan. It just felt like they couldn't stop anybody. It felt a lot like the LSU game last year, actually. And so that's the reason for that is really the youth. And Florida doesn't have that excuse this year because there are not going to be a ton of true freshmen who are going to, or even redshirt freshmen for that matter, who are going to be relied on heavily. I don't think there's nobody that we're sitting there going, oh, that guy has to be good. Whereas, you said, oh, Joe Hayden, he's going to have to play well. And we didn't necessarily see that, at least not, I mean, he showed a lot of promise, but certainly got burned from time to time as well. I think, you look at the Muschamp, and Muschamp actually lasted 4. So you said 3, but I think so.
But that's what they said. It laid the groundwork. For him.
Well, we were all ready to get rid of him after year 3. That's certainly for sure. But again, I think that is a recruiting issue. I mean, he comes in and he doesn't have enough offensive linemen. Everything's off balance. He can only get defensive recruits to come in. The offense is just putrid. And by year 3,
in the preseason, the injury laden preseason.
Yeah, and I mean, by year 3, he was on his 3rd offensive coordinator and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think there were multiple reasons to believe that there were going to be issues there. I think McElwain, for a lot of different reasons, recruiting being one of them, but also just the fact that he had the credit card 9 and all that stuff heading into the season, and the one score losses to A&M and LSU sort of snowballed into stuff.
Fishing trips,
sharks. Death threats, all that sort of stuff. And then again, I think you look at Mullen, and those excuses are not necessarily there. So his transition class was 14th when you looked at it nationally. That's not where Florida needs to be, but it's not terrible. And it's certainly the level of talent that he's been bringing in kind of sense. He hasn't been bringing in a whole lot better recruiting classes than that. You look at the influx of people from that 2018 class who are going to contribute this year. I mean, Emory Jones is going to contribute. Jacob Copeland's going to contribute. You've got Trey Dean, Amari Burney, Kyle Pitts. Like, these are guys who have the potential to be all SEC, especially Pitts. But if things fall right, if something happens to Trask, Emory Jones has an opportunity to do that. Jacob Copeland could do that if he steps up. So there's a lot of guys who are going to be highly counted on from that 2018 class. And so you have, like you said, you haven't seen an exodus, or at least you've seen Mullen hit on guys from that 2018 class. And then you mentioned the transfers, and I think that's a big deal too. Being able to fill your holes. They were able to do that last year with Grenard. They're going to try to fill Grenard's hole with Brenton Cox. You've got Lingard, who got approved to come in. Justin Shorter, if he winds up getting approved to come in and play this year, then you've got an extra weapon at receiver. So being able to bring in those guys, I think, makes a difference. There are holes though, right? There are holes.
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to replace David Reese at linebacker? That's a key question. Are Ventrell Miller and James Houston going to be able to do that? What's going to happen to Trey Dean? Is he going to move back to safety? What do you do with the guys who are already at safety? So there's a lot of questions that are going to have to be resolved. But I think there are answers, or there are at least multiple things Florida can test. And those are the things they've really been missing in year 3. And what most coaches are missing in year 3 is that depth. If you decide you're going to put Joe Hayden on the outside and it doesn't work out, all right, we're going to have some growing pains. If you decide, last year they decided to put Trey Dean at star, and that didn't work out real well. And so there were some growing pains as they did that, but they had some options, right? Being able to move Marco Wilson inside, having Kyrie Elam on the outside. They're going to have those options again this year with Jadon Hill and Chester Kimbrough having gotten experience last year, and then Jahari Rogers and some other guys that are coming in as true freshmen this year as well. So I think Florida's positioned better in 2020 to be able to withstand that third-year drop. I think there's an opportunity, though, for a pretty significant mass exodus after this year, which is why 2020 is so important.
Yeah, both magazines here do list Kyer Elam as the emerging rising star there. So no surprise there from what we saw from him last year. Of course, in the bowl game, making that game-sealing interception versus Virginia. big time player there. He'll be on the field a whole lot more this year, of course, and I think Gator fans are pretty excited to see him there. Numbers to know from Athlon before we kind of wrap up this section of it, before we go into some particulars for the players. Numbers to know: 8.96. Florida's defense recorded 49 sacks as a unit in 2019, and opponents attempted 390 passes against the Gators. As a result, Florida averaged 1 sack every 8.96 pass plays, the best sack rate in the SEC and second best in the country, only behind Ohio State. Another number to know: 20.89%. Tackles for loss, forced fumbles, and passes defense are considered havoc plays, and havoc rate is the percentage of total plays in which a defense creates havoc. Florida produced a 20.89% havoc rate in 2019, which was also the highest mark in the SEC and sixth best in the country. So, well, I mean, two numbers to know right there, all kind of shifted toward the defense. And with all the praise that we just heard opposing coaches give Todd Grantham, part of it is because, the sack rate, the havoc rate, and creating plenty of disruption for an offense. It's just, I don't know how many other ways and more times we can say it. We just gotta see it in the bigger games here. But the base of Todd Grantham, we know what we're getting. You're going to get a defense that flies. You're going to get a defense that attacks, and he's going to find ways to do it. This year, he's just going to have to do it with finding ways to replace Jabari Zuniga and Jonathan Grenard.
Yeah, it's a team that's lived by the big play and died by the big play, right? So
Yeah.
those sacks really put Florida in a position to generate turnovers, get good field position, put their offense in a position to succeed. But the two plays that I remember from last season are the blown coverage against Lawrence Cager and Jamar Chase making CJ Henderson look slow on the dagger from LSU. And
before you go further, Will, I just said sacks and havoc rate. When have we seen sacks, and when have we seen havoc versus Georgia? We haven't.
Well, we didn't see it against LSU last year either,
No,
right?
right.
We saw it 2 years against LSU, and Burrow was pretty pedestrian, but last year they weren't able to do that. And look, I mean, Grantham is able to scheme guys to be able to get pass rush from time to time. But at some point, your guys have to win one-on-one battles. And in those games against Georgia's and LSU's and Alabama's, there are just times where you're going to have to win some one-on-one battles. And, that's the exciting part about having somebody like Cox. That's the exciting part about potentially Tyron Hopper getting time at linebacker, Derek Wingo coming in this year, Gervon Dexter at defensive tackle, especially if he can occupy a double team and free up the guys on the outside. Well, now all of a sudden you don't have to come up with all sorts of exotic blitz packages to get pressure, and it allows you to do some things on the backside of the defense where maybe you disguise some coverages because those guys aren't sort of a step slow because they're wondering who they're going to have to cover for up front. So it's all sort of it's a cascading thing. The pressure certainly leads to turnovers. The turnovers lead to good field position for the offense, and the offense last year was able to convert. But like you said, the timing of the sacks. I mean, I think you had 10 against Miami to start the year. Obviously, every one of those 10 was important because they barely got out of that game. But
eight versus Florida State, so 18 of your 49 sacks are in those two games.
Yeah, and third down and whatever, they couldn't get any pressure on Fromm, and again, that's the difference. And I think we said this about Felipe Franks 2 years ago, coming into last year's season, is that Franks had some pretty high highs and some really low lows in 2018, and I wasn't necessarily looking for him to take a step forward where his highs were that much higher. I was just looking for him to be a little bit more even. And I think you could say the same thing about the defense. Is when they were getting to the quarterback, the defense looked like it was unstoppable. When they weren't getting to the quarterback, they couldn't stop anybody. And there were even games like they made I can't remember his name, but the Kentucky backup quarterback before they brought in Bowden. They made him look like a star in the first half.
Sawyer Smith.
Sawyer, yeah, I think that's right.
So, I think that's right. Yeah,
they made him look like a star, and the next week he got booted, and they wouldn't let him play anymore. I mean, granted, he hurt his wrist in the game against Florida.
Yeah.
But still, they made that guy look like a star for a half. There were multiple times during the year where they struggled to get off the field for a quarter, for a half, and then there would be a quarter where just the offense went backwards. And again, the only time that didn't happen was against Georgia and LSU, and lo and behold, there's the two games they lost.
Yep. So there was a good clear look there at Athlon and Lindy's and their preview specifically of Florida. We'll get into some more player specific, all American teams, all SEC teams here before we do. But before we get there, support for today's episode, of course, comes from the guys at Manscaped. Manscaped has the right tools to get the job done quickly and safely and hygienically. Father's Day is just around the corner, and you probably need a gift for your hairy dad. Get him and yourself the Manscaped Perfect Package. Manscaped is the only men's brand dedicated to below-the-waist grooming and hygiene. Manscaped is forever changing the grooming game, with the Perfect Package 3.0 Essentials Kit. The Perfect Package 3.0 kit comes with the new and improved Lawnmower 3.0 waterproof cordless body trimmer and a ton of other liquid formulations to round out your manscaping routine. This third-generation trimmer features a cutting-edge ceramic blade to prevent manscaping accidents, nick-free shaving thanks to Manscaped's advanced skin-safe technology. And, of course, let's not forget about the Crop Preserver, an anti-chafing ball deodorant and moisturizer. When you purchase the new Perfect Package 3.0 kit at manscaped.com, you get the biggest bang for your buck. Subscribers get a new replacement blade refill for your lawnmower trimmer delivered to your door every 3 months, making sure your trimmer always stays fresh and clean. For a limited time, subscribers get not one, but 2 free gifts: the Shed Travel Bag, a $39 value, and the patented high-performance anti-chafing Manscaped Boxer Briefs. Just a few days left until Father's Day, so go out there and get 20% off plus free shipping with the code Gators at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code Gators at manscaped.com. So Will, not a lot of high-end look for the Gators if you want to kind of look at how these two publications look at All-American teams. Athlon, All-American team, lists Kyle Pitts as the third team tight end and the only Gator on their All-American list. And Lindy's All-American team lists Kyle Pitts as a second team All-American. So if you go and look at the nation's best players and how they, kind of just make these All-American teams and put them together, the only Gator on the list is Kyle Pitts. So no surprise Kyle Pitts is on the list. Maybe a surprise that he's only third team on the Athlon and second team on Lindy's, but no surprise that it is Kyle Pitts. If you were going to choose one Gator to be, if you're only going to choose one, if you said there was only one Gator on an All-American list, Kyle Pitts was going to be that player.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think Pitts is the guy who was the big weapon last year, and really sort of dominated the first half against LSU, and beyond just dominating that first half, LSU came out with a game plan in the second half to stop him, and all of a sudden Van Jefferson was open, and a lot of that was I mean, obviously Jefferson was running good routes, but Pitts was the reason that he was open because he was drawing so much attention. That's really the reason I think maybe he's not first team All-American, is because he's going to draw so much attention from opposing defenses, especially early on, that it's likely going to dictate that Trask goes elsewhere in his progressions. Like, Trask has proven that he's not going to force the ball into a guy who's double teamed, especially if that double team is opening up something someplace else. So the guy I would look for, and the guy I'm a little bit surprised hasn't gotten a little bit more run, is Trevone Grimes. I mean, he was somebody I was high on coming into last year, and just they basically made everybody share time at wide receiver, but Grimes still was able to get 33 catches last year, averaged almost 15 yards per catch, and a lot of that was sort of bubble screens and things like that. He was really sort of left out there to block oftentimes. I think Grimes is going to see the ball a lot more this year, in particular because people are going to be scheming against Kyle Pitts, and you're not going to necessarily have LaMichael Pirine coming out of the backfield to get the 40 catches that he had last year either. So I'd look for Grimes maybe to be the guy that steps up. He's certainly got the pedigree, has shown a level of productivity that the other receivers haven't shown yet. And so he's maybe the guy I'd look to benefit. If in fact Pitts ends up being third team All-American, it'll be because maybe Florida has to go someplace else because he's the focus.
All right. Yep. And then try to, kind of look at here and somewhere some of the other units, right? So, quarterback unit and certain players as well. I mean, and look, you go look at these All American lists, we can certainly see players like Kyle Trask and Kyrie Elam, or even pass rushers like Brenton Cox, Jeremiah Moon, on these postseason All American lists. And, especially pass rushers for Todd Grantham, you can kind of just maybe pick one, and you may be right of where those guys kind of show up from what we've seen from pass rushers in this defense the last couple of years. But with quarterbacks, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields out there, Trask of course he's going to be behind those guys in any preseason list there. But it's kind of open season after those two of where you want to go with quarterbacks. There's a lot of Sam Ellinger and Ian Book love fest over Kyle Trask that I maybe Sam Ellinger because the year before last, he didn't really live up to it last year to me. But the whole Ian Book at Notre Dame Love Fest, I don't get that one. He's pedestrian as they get there. I don't get that one. Will the track record's longer? Maybe that's why you put him, but I don't know. But Athlon lists Florida as having the 12th best quarterback unit. There, Georgia comes in at 11, and that's of course with Jamie Newman and no JT Daniels. Of course, their publication was out before then, and plus we don't even know if he'll be eligible this coming up season. I don't know. When they say best quarterback unit, they don't really explain it all too much, but they do list quarterback depth as far as the other teams go. They list 1 through 5, and they kind of go through the whole depth chart. So I'm assuming they're counting Emory Jones and Anthony Richardson in this list too. But Florida only comes in at 12, Georgia 11, and then Lindy's, they do list Kyle Trask as the 14th top quarterback in the country. But as I said, he's behind other quarterbacks like Ian Book and Sam Ellinger and quarterbacks like that.
All right, I got to take a little bit of umbrage here with having Florida's quarterback unit behind Georgia.
Yeah.
Because Georgia has Carson Beck and Jamie Newman. And before this publication, JT Daniels wasn't on there. But even with JT Daniels, you're looking at a guy who was relatively pedestrian at USC. You've got a recruit who sort of fell off last year in his senior year to the point where, he's somebody that people thought was going to push for a 5th star and wound up, barely holding on to the 4-star ranking. And then you got Jamie Newman, a guy who's coming over from Wake Forest. And I wrote an article about Newman a couple of weeks ago. When you look at the film, he's got some skills, but he's also got some limitations. And I think Georgia's going to experience that this year. Trask and Emory Jones are kind of, I think Mullen even said during his press conference today, he expects Emory Jones to play quite a bit. So you're going to get more out of those two guys than Georgia's going to get out of their two guys and their top two guys. And I don't know. I don't see that. I think the Newman hype is really, I think, something that comes out of people trusting Georgia's defense. I think if Georgia wins, it's going to be because their defense is outstanding. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be because of their offense. And Georgia's also replacing a couple of offensive linemen who went really, really high in the draft. And if you looked at it last year, their passing game got worse under Fromm, but their running game wasn't all that great either. And so I think there are some opportunities here for. It's not a sure thing that Georgia's offense gets better. And it's not a sure thing, even if Jamie Newman turns out to be a pretty good quarterback, it's not a sure thing that Georgia's offense is going to get a lot better. I think there's a lot more certainty on the Florida side. I'm with you. I don't get the Sam Ellinger or the Ian Book talk. When Ellinger wins 10 games, maybe I think it's 2 years ago he did. But, Texas just sort of fell off a cliff last year. And, we wouldn't put a quarterback at top 10 if he allowed his team to go 7-5 or 8-4, whatever they did last year in the SEC, and they're not even in the SEC, right? They're in the Big 12, so I think that's a tick mark against him. The Notre Dame stuff is just because if Notre Dame wins out, or if Notre Dame goes 11-1, they're going to be in the playoff conversation, just because of the nature of college football. But and Book 2 years ago again had a very good season, but again I think last year was pretty pedestrian. So yeah, I think one of the things is that it was very popular coming out sort of into the spring for people to say, hey, Florida's a playoff dark horse. Trask can really step forward. And as people have gotten closer and closer to the season, that's become less popular because it's already been the hot take that's out there. So they haven't necessarily kept that hot take up. I think the running game is going to be a lot better. I think that's going to open up some things for Trask. I don't think he's going to be a Heisman Trophy candidate. I don't think that's what we're looking at. But as far as being a really efficient player, I think the Florida quarterback room is ahead of Georgia, and I don't think it's particularly close.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to break up this episode a bit too, with a lot of the singling out players and position groups that we were going to do, because there's something I definitely want to get in before we have our Georgia debate episode next week. Some things that we're planning on for this episode. This episode always goes long, so I probably should have predicted that this was probably going to be a two-parter. So yeah, we'll definitely break it up here. But for that quarterback list, Lindy's where they had Kyle Trask ranked 14th, Justin Fields 1, Trevor Lawrence 2, Sam Ehlinger 3, Sam Howell, North Carolina quarterback at 4, De'Aaron King, Miami quarterback at 5. I like him. He's not the 5th best quarterback in college football. I'm sorry. Kadon Slovis, of course, USC. Ian Book at 7. Jamie Newman at 8. Tanner Morgan from Minnesota at 9. Brock Purdy, Iowa State, 10. Sean Clifford, Penn State, 11. Shane Buechele, SMU at 12. Brady White, Memphis, 13. And Kyle Trask, 14. Kellen Mond, 15 there. So they do have Kyle Trask in front of Kellen Mond. But so Jamie Newman, the only SEC quarterback in front of Kyle Trask. So, I mean, like I said, behind Fields and Lawrence, you really almost can kind of shake them up and come up with any kind of order you want to there. But, some of them, I don't think, some of them are a bit too high, but I guess,
I think when you look at Ehlinger, his stats are pretty similar to Trask last year: 32 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 8.1 yards per attempt.
And played in more games.
And played in 13 games. But Derek King, I have a hard time getting behind. Obviously, he played ahead of Trask in high school, had a couple of good years at Houston, but I really hesitate to believe that playing 4 games and then redshirting as a senior is the so that you can transfer. There's a leadership component to being a quarterback, and that's a difficult one for me to swallow. I think he has every right to do it. I'm actually happy that players are starting to push on the power that they have, but it does make me wonder, about his ability to take control of a program and what's going to happen at Miami when things get difficult, right? So yeah, like you said, I mean, end of the year, we're going to look back at this and say, nobody knew what they were talking about anyway. And just like last year, right? I mean, who would have thought coming out last year, we would have said Florida found their quarterback. And then who would have thought that 3 weeks into the offseason, we would have been in a bitter intergator fight about whether Emory Jones or Kyle Trask needs to start. So, nobody knows anything, and that's one of the beauties of college football is you think you do, you spend all offseason previewing, and at the end of the day, you end up with an injury like you did last year to Felipe Franks, or you end up with, Kyle Pitts all of a sudden takes a next step and is a first-team All-American, and Trask is just hitting him with everything, and it makes defenses bend in a way that you didn't expect. Or maybe Florida's offensive line is way better, and all of a sudden Dameon Pierce is putting up a 1,600-yard season, and it just changes the entire complexion of things. So that's one of the great things about college football. I mean, heck, you look at North Carolina last year with Sam Howell. I think people were sort of surprised when he was named the starting quarterback coming right out of the gate, and he had an excellent season. So I can see why people will think he will progress. But this is the other thing, is that progression, especially at quarterback, but even within teams, is rarely linear. And so the idea that Trask is going to make this giant leap is probably out of the realm of possibilities. But I think we're all pretty confident he's not going to take a significant step back. I think when you look at a guy like Ehlinger, there is a track record for him where you look at it and say, he's been kind of inconsistent. I can see him potentially taking a step back. Maybe he's capped out. Same with Ian Book. That's the one thing that scares me about Jamie Newman, is I do think that if he can put together some of the skills that he has, he's got some real skills. I just doubt whether he's going to be able to do that. But Newman is not a guy who's got a weak arm and is maximizing his ability. He's got a cannon, and if he can put it together, then Georgia could be pretty scary. But again, we won't know that until we see him play against Alabama and Auburn and Florida.
All right, so let's go, Will. So something that's gonna, it has garnered a lot of headlines from Athlon's side already, and it definitely will. And when we bring it up, we'll talk about it here. We'll talk about it when we have Braden Gall on next week, as well. But like I said, we'll get into a lot more of the All SEC team and All American team. They're kind of the top end players that, not many Gators up there in the top end of the players as far as national players go. But Will, Athlon ranks the SEC coaches here, and number one is no surprise, Nick Saban. Of course, he's going to be number one. Yeah, and until somebody consistently knocks him down, he's going to stay number one until he retires. Number two is one Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen from Athlon has him. They have Dan Mullen as the number two coach in the SEC, ahead of Kirby Smart, Ed Orgeron, and Jimbo Fisher to round out the top five. They have Mike Leach at number 6 already as well. So it kind of, and proved it at Washington State a little bit in bringing that program. Of course, the Texas Tech days as well. I like to see how it translates to the SEC. But here's what they say about Dan Mullen. Being number two, Mullen is one of the best coaches in the nation at maximizing his roster. Mississippi State won one of the toughest jobs in the SEC. Went 69-46 with 8 bowl trips from 2009 to 17 under Mullen. And in just 2 years at Florida, Mullen has returned the program to national prominence. The Gators won 10 games in Mullen's debut in 2018 and upped the win total by 1. Last season, under Mullen, Florida is 21-5 overall, has finished in the top 10 nationally back-to-back years, and has 2 New Year's 6 bowl victories. Yay. Good. They have Mullen number 2. I can't put him number 2 until he beats Kirby Smart. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. I mean, his last year at Mississippi State got waxed by Georgia and Kirby Smart there in that year. And in the last 2 years, it's looked closer on the scoreboard than it really is. Florida's been scrappy in those games. Georgia's been in control for the game. Didn't really have – you thought it would take, some kind of act for Florida to win those games versus Georgia. A lot of people kind of jumping on the Florida bandwagon heading into those games and picking Florida. But until Mullen beats Kirby, Kirby's got to be at number 2 for me. Edo just won a national championship. You can definitely have him there in the top 5. Jimbo at number 5 too, maybe. He's won a national title at FSU. Has Texas A&M really taken off any more than when Kevin Sumlin was there in these last 2 years? I mean, everybody keeps pointing at Texas A&M and Jimbo there, but I haven't seen the step yet. They're recruiting well. We'll see where that goes. But, well, I mean, and like I said, we'll get into it more next week, but kind of surprised Mullen's number 2 behind Saban and in front of Smart?
I'm surprised he's number 2. I'm surprised he's not behind Orgeron.
Yeah.
I think Orgeron's done an outstanding job at LSU, including a national championship. And, the criticism of him at Ole Miss was that he was stuck in his ways and wouldn't change. And all of a sudden he brings in Joe Brady and Joe Burrow and the team takes off. And all of a sudden they win a national championship with an offense that can't be stopped. And, I think so the way I like to evaluate coaches is I like to look at their national recruiting ranking, and then I like to look at their FPI rating from ESPN, because I think FPI, it's not perfect, but over a few years really starts to tell you a picture of what's going on. And when you look at Georgia from 2011 to 2015, Mark Richt had recruiting classes that averaged 8.4, and his FPI was 12.0. Kirby Smart has had recruiting classes at 3.0, and his FPI in his 4 years is 13. Now, granted, that includes the 2016 season, but he has finishes of third, and fifth in FPI. Richt had finishes of 4th and 5th. So the results on the field at Georgia are really about the same as the results that they were getting under Mark Richt. They just have more hope because the recruiting is better. When you look at Dan Mullen, before he came to Florida, the Gators were recruiting. Their average national recruiting ranking from 2011 to 17 was 10. Their FPI was 28.1. So Muschamp and McElwain couldn't even field a top 25 team on average over the course of those years, which obviously we all lived through and understand that's true. Mullen's come in. He's had recruiting rankings of 12.5 and then FPI of 10 in 18 and 19. So he's been living up to his recruiting ranking. Kirby Smart hasn't. And, you mentioned Orgeron. He's at 7.3 for his recruiting ranking, 10 for his FPI. And that's exactly what Les Miles did before that. So I think Orgeron is a very good coach. I don't think anybody's ever going to look back and call him Saban. But the guy's got a national championship and an SEC championship on his resume, and he didn't choke away the national championship like Kirby Smart did. So I think you got to put him at a Smart. And I think there are reasons to put Dan Mullen in front of Kirby Smart. I mean, you look at, I mentioned it earlier, but if you look at 2016 to 2019, where Mullen spent 2 of those years at Mississippi State, Smart's gone 0 for 2 against more talented teams. Mullen's gone 11 for 22 in those games, so 50%. And typically, coaches who have talent that Florida has win those games about 34% of the time. So he's winning games against more talented teams more often than you would expect. But the thing that's really surprising is if you look at Georgia and you look at Mullen over those time spans from 2016 to 2019, is against top 25 talent, Georgia's 17-27. And against top 25 talent, Florida's 17-27. So you think about that. Florida and Mississippi State have played 22 games against more talented teams, which means only 5 times has Mullen played top 25 teams that weren't more talented than his, and he's won 17 games. Smart has played 25 teams that are less talented than him in the top 25, and he's only won 17. And he's only won 17 of those games. So I think that does indicate that the in-game coaching and the development really does make a difference. But obviously, you got to win the game against Smart because nobody gives you a trophy for winning a statistical battle. At some point, you got to win the game on the field.
Yep. And like I said, we'll get into that even more. We'll have our Florida-Georgia debate show. It'll be pretty fun there. A lot to digest there. So, yeah, as I said, there's plenty more to get into with these college football magazines and the unit rankings where, Florida's quarterbacks, running backs, offensive line, and, defensive line, linebackers, DB, all that ranks. We'll get into all of that. They kind of compare it to last year too. I think that's a pretty interesting part in comparing how many players were on the All SEC last year, where they were, and all that. So plenty more to get in that. Next year, I'll know we'll break this down into 2 episodes.
Make a note. It's funny that in a year where you're looking for content,
yeah,
where like there hasn't been any sports that we didn't just decide to do this, and spread it into 2. But hey, I think we both anticipate we'll be less wordy than we end up being for this. So we all have thoughts. It's good. I think people appreciate the extra episode. Hopefully they do.
Yeah. And like I said, these come out a little bit later than they normally did, so we would have had plenty of time. So now it's kind of all wrapped around as players are coming back on campus and all that good stuff. SEC Media Days, by the way, which will be virtual. So we did get that announcement last week. So that gummit will no trip to Atlanta and hanging out there, all virtual for SEC Media Days this year.
Well, I'll have to crash the Zoom meeting with like a bourbon or something on SEC Media Days, so I could be a pain in everybody's butt. But, it's everybody's doing it that way, right? I mean, we're all learning how to use Zoom meetings. We're all relying on those sorts of things. I got sales guys at work right now who haven't traveled for 3 months. It's driving them crazy. So I've enjoyed it. I haven't had to go anywhere, so it's been kind of nice to be at home. And for a while there, I was getting home real early because we had split things up. So obviously it's an interesting time for everybody. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy out there, but you make the best of it. And that's what the SEC is going to do, making sure everybody is fully distanced by doing it via Zoom.
Yep. Well, what you got coming up on the site this week, Read and Reaction?
Yeah. So I'm going to be
coming up, maybe not this week, but coming up.
Yeah. So I'm going to be looking at some strengths I think I've found in Kyle Trask that I talked about his floor, that our expectation is that he's not going to take a step back, that he might not take he's not, nobody's going to take a Burrow step forward, but, is he going to be Jake Fromm? Is he going to be, better than Jake Fromm? What does his ceiling look like? And why do I think that ceiling exists? That's one of the things I'm going to be looking at in the next week or 2.
Awesome. So be sure to look at it there at readandreaction.com, and you can find Twill. There we go. Will on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. Twill.
That's my new nickname now.
Right? There we go. That's going to be your Twitter nickname, Twill.
Thanks, buddy. I can always count on you to mispronounce a name. That's for sure.
All right. Will Miles, as I said, you can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC and his site, readandreaction.com. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.